In the last couple of years, I have been vexed about a question pertaining to leadership. A question that vexed me so much, it almost became an obsession in my life. And the only way I could frame the question was to ask it this way: what precedes vision? In leadership settings, we always put vision as the top of the list, at the top of the list. Vision is the most potent weapon in the leader's arsenal. And I wanted to ask the question, what happens inside a leader that is so powerful that it eventually gives birth to a vision at a later point in time? That question started to really work its way into my psyche. We've all been cheering on Billy Graham these past few months as he spoke to hundreds of thousands of people in the New York City area at what has been called his last crusade. Billy has been filling stadiums for almost 60 years. He's had a burning vision to help people all over the world understand the power and the love of Jesus Christ. But my question was this: what happened inside of Billy before he held his first crusade? What happened inside Billy Graham's heart that was so powerful, so incendiary, that it eventually gave birth to the vision of filling stadiums with people who needed to know about Christ? What happened that was so powerful that he went out and rented that first stadium? I reasoned to myself, whatever that experience was, that must have been something. And I went on this assumption that there's some powerful firestorm experience in the lives of most people that sort of forces them into leadership, forces them to birth a vision that then they can act on. So I've been thinking about this, obsessed with it. And one day I'm trudging my way through the book of Exodus, just doing my daily Bible reading, which I strongly recommend for every leader. You think I'm kidding? Read your Bible every day. Just read your Bible every day. Doesn't have to be long, just read it every day. And I was reading through the Old Testament book of Exodus. I came across the story of Moses, one of the great leaders in antiquity. And I believe I discovered the defining experience that forced Moses into leadership, whether he wanted to lead or not. I think it was his firestorm experience. Let me just refer to the account. If you brought a Bible, it's in Exodus chapter 2. Verse 11 says this: one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. Side note, just for context. Moses was a Hebrew, a Jew. He had been raised in Egypt by the Pharaoh's daughter. He was accustomed to the wealth and the privilege and education that accompanied that Egyptian upbringing. But he was not an Egyptian again. He was a Jew. The text says that one day he went out to see his own people, his own people. They were involved in hard labor. Most of you know that the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites, worked them mercilessly, had them making bricks in the midday sun and so. So back to the text in verse 11 again. While Moses is watching the hard labor, the daily oppression of his own people, he sees an Egyptian soldier, we think, beating one of his own people, beating a Hebrew. Now, Moses is watching an Egyptian guy just beating, smashing the nose and spattering the blood of one of his fellow Hebrews. This is a Hebrew who's already being worked to the bone. And Moses got to a point, he just couldn't take it anymore. The sights and the sounds and the splattering blood was too much, and something snapped inside of him. Verse 12 in Exodus 2 says, glancing this way and that, he came to the defense of his countrymen. He just had to. Pulls the Egyptian off the Hebrew guy, and of course then they start fighting, and Moses winds up killing that Egyptian, and he buried him in the sand. The scriptures go on to say the very next day, Moses goes out and he's looking at his people being oppressed again. And this day he sees two Hebrews beating each other up. Same sounds. Same sights. The smashing of teeth and the splattering of blood. And he breaks the fight up. And he says, why? Why are you beating a fellow Hebrew? What are you thinking? Our people are in forced labor. We get beat by Egyptians every day. That's bad enough. Don't fight with each other. And I think Moses just saw all the oppression and the frustration of the Hebrew people. And it took him to the absolute edge of his emotional limits, where he thinks, I just can't stand this anymore. It's all madness. Now fast forward a few frames to the famous burning bush story, which is recorded in Exodus 3. You all know it. Moses comes to a bush that's on fire. It just doesn't get consumed. And at that bush, he hears the voice of God call his name. And God tells him to take off his sandals because he's standing on what? Holy ground. And as a kid in Sunday school, I used to have the impression that it was the shock and awe of that burning bush that scared Moses into leadership. But upon further reflection in more recent days, the burning bush, in my opinion, was just an attention grabber. It was just enough to slow Moses down long enough to hear what God had to say. Exodus 3, verse 7. Moses, get these words now. God, I have seen the misery of the people in Egypt. Seen the misery of the Israelites in Egypt. I have heard the sounds. I've heard them crying out. And I'm concerned about their suffering, and I'm going to rescue them. And I'm going to use you to do it. Now, fellow leaders, please get this if you get nothing else from this session. I think what's really happening here is God is saying, Moses, what you saw that day that made you so unbelievably angry, what you saw when the Egyptian guy was beating the living daylights out of that Hebrew slave, what you saw and heard when the two Hebrew guys were so frustrated and angry and hopeless about their situation that they started beating each other up, what you have been seeing, I have been seeing, I have been hearing, I have been watching, and I can't stand it anymore either. And I'm stirred in my spirit, and I'm going to do something from heaven, and I'm going to assign you to be my emissary on earth. And I'm choosing you in part because I see you're stirred in spirit about the same thing that's stirring me. I see a passion in you for your people. I see your emotion. I see a man who can't stand idly by when his people are oppressed and beaten up. I see what it does to you inside, Moses. I see your capacity for activism. I've been looking for that. I've been looking all over, and I have found the man I want. I'm going to harness that internal firestorm of frustration that's raging in you. I'm going to harness that and use it in a positive way to set my people free. That furnace of frustration is going to forge leadership, mettle, and fortitude in you, and I'm going to use that. This is key to understanding leadership, in my humble opinion. God's heart and a human heart being aligned perfectly around what frustrates heaven and earth, what frustrates the character and nature of God, and what frustrates a potential leader to the point of absolute angst.